Welcome to Sleep Theories. Before we begin tonight's story, I want to connect with you, wherever you are in this world. How was your day? What time is it where you're listening? Are you settling in for the night in New York, catching this during your morning commute in London, or perhaps listening while the sun sets in California? Whatever brought you here tonight, thank you for joining us. If you enjoy these deep dives into the mysteries that haunt our recent history, please subscribe to Sleep Theories. Your support helps us continue uncovering the stories they'd rather you forget. Now let me tell you about my friend Terry, Officer Terrance Yeakey, and let me tell you why, 28 years later, I still check my rearview mirror twice before I park. The morning of April 19th, 1995 started like any other Wednesday in Oklahoma City. I was working dispatch when the call came in at 9:02 a.m. At first, we thought it was a gas explosion, maybe a boiler malfunction at the Alfred P. Murrah Federal Building. The initial reports were confused, fragmented. Someone screaming about a collapsed building, children crying. The word bomb hadn't even entered our vocabulary yet. Terry was 3 blocks away when it happened. Officer Terrance Yeakey, Oklahoma City Police Department, badge number 573. He was the kind of cop who still believed the badge meant something, still believed we were the good guys. He was the first one inside the rubble, and maybe that's where his life ended, even if he didn't know it yet. I didn't see Terry until that evening. When he finally made it back to the station, he looked like he'd aged 10 years in 8 hours. His uniform was covered in concrete dust and blood, some his own, most belonging to the people he'd pulled from the wreckage. His hands were cut to hell from digging through twisted metal and broken glass, but his eyes were different, haunted in a way I'd never seen before. "How many?" I asked him as he sat down heavily in the chair across from my desk. 4 confirmed saves, he said quietly. Maybe more. Hard to tell in all that chaos. The news was already calling him a hero. Officer Yeakey, first responder, saviour of innocence. They'd interview him the next day, and he'd give them the standard lines about doing his duty, about how anyone would have done the same. But that night, sitting in our nearly empty station house, he wasn't thinking about heroism. "Something's not right about this whole thing," he said, staring at his bandaged hands. "What do you mean?" Terry looked around the room, even though we were practically alone. How fast they got there. The feds, I mean. A TF, FBI, agents I didn't recognise. They were suiting up and organising before our backup even arrived. Maybe they were in the area. Maybe. But the way he said it told me he didn't believe that for a second. That was the beginning. The first crack in Terry's faith in the system he'd sworn to serve. Over the next few days, as the official story began to take shape, domestic terrorist Timothy McVeigh, lone wolf, fertilizer bomb in a rental truck, Terry started asking questions that made people uncomfortable. He'd always been thorough, is what made him a good cop. But after the bombing, his thoroughness became something else, an obsession. He started keeping a journal, writing down everything he remembered from that morning, every detail, no matter how small, the position of vehicles, the timing of arrivals, the faces of agents who seemed to know exactly where to go in a building that had just been destroyed. "I'm going to figure this out," he told me about a week after the bombing. "Something happened in that building that they don't want us to know about. Terry, maybe you should talk to someone, a counsellor. What you saw in there..." "This isn't PTSD, he cut me off. "This is about the truth." He rented a safety deposit box at a bank across town, started making copies of everything, his incident reports, photographs he'd taken with his personal camera, witness statements that didn't make it into the official record. He became paranoid about his regular locker at the station, convinced someone was going through his things. "They're watching me," he told his ex-wife Tonya during one of their phone calls about their kids. She'd tell me about it later, after everything happened, how Terry's voice had changed, how he'd started checking his car for tracking devices. The Heroes Medal ceremony was scheduled for May 1996. The mayor wanted to present it personally. Local news would be there. It should have been the highlight of Terry's career. Instead, he spent those weeks talking about federal agents who arrived too quickly, about surveillance footage that disappeared, about explosive residue patterns that didn't match the official story. He said he didn't trust anyone anymore, Tonya would tell me years later. He didn't even trust me by the end. By the fall of 1995, Terry had changed. The easy smile was gone. He'd lost weight, started working double shifts, claiming he needed the overtime. But I knew he was avoiding going home to an empty apartment where he'd lie awake replaying that morning over and over. He'd developed a routine. Every Friday after his shift, he'd drive to that bank across town and spend an hour in the safety deposit box room, adding pages to his growing file. Sometimes he'd come back to the station afterward looking grim. "Find something interesting?" I asked one evening. "You ever notice how fast the ATF response team got to the scene?" Terry asked instead of answering. "They're trained for this kind of thing." "They're trained, sure, but they're not psychic." Terry pulled out a small notebook, not his official one, but a personal journal he'd started keeping. According to radio logs, first ATF agents were on scene at 9:17 a.m., 15 minutes after the blast. So, their offices are in Dallas. It's a 3.5-hour drive to Oklahoma City. How'd they get there so fast? I thought about it. Maybe they were already in town. For what? There was no ATF operation in Oklahoma City that morning. I checked. His voice dropped. Unless there was one they didn't want us to know about. That's when Terry started talking about what he'd seen inside the building. Not the heroic rescue parts that made it into the news reports, but the other things. The inconsistencies. "I found a man on the 3rd floor," he told me one night, crushed under debris, probably dead for an hour, but his watch had stopped at 9:04. Watches break in explosions, Terry. Sure, but his body was warm, fresh blood, like he'd been injured after the blast, not during it. Terry's paranoia was becoming infectious. I started noticing things too. How certain federal agents seemed to know exactly where to look in the wreckage. How quickly they cordoned off sections of the building. How witness statements were being revised to match the official timeline. But it was the photographs that really convinced me Terry was onto something. He'd brought his personal camera to the scene, against regulations, but in the chaos, nobody noticed. The pictures he took in those first crucial hours showed things that didn't make it into the FBI's evidence collection. "Look at this," he said, spreading the photos across his kitchen table. "See that van parked behind the building?" I looked. There was indeed a white van, positioned oddly close to the rear of the federal building. "Now look at this photo, taken 30 minutes later." The van was gone. Could have been moved by emergency crews. Could have been, but look at the license plate in the first photo. I squinted. The plate was partially visible but readable. "Did you run it?" "I tried. Came back as classified. Government vehicle." Terry had dozens of these photographs. Vehicles that appeared and disappeared. People in federal jackets who seemed to be directing operations before any official command structure was established. Areas of the building that were sealed off immediately, before proper forensic teams arrived. "They knew," Terry said quietly. "Somehow, they knew this was going to happen." The next week, Terry's apartment was broken into. Nothing valuable was taken. His TV, stereo, cash were all untouched. But his home office had been carefully searched. Papers shuffled through, computer files accessed. "Professional job," Terry told me. "Whoever did this knew what they were looking for." That's when he started varying his routes to work, started using payphones instead of his home line, started making copies of copies and storing them in multiple locations. "I'm not crazy," he insisted. "Someone doesn't want me asking these questions." His ex-wife Tonya started getting strange phone calls, hang-ups, voices asking about Terry's whereabouts. She began limiting the kids' visits to his apartment. "He told me he had evidence that would blow the case wide open," she'd tell investigators later. "Said he was going to take it to someone at the Department of Justice who could be trusted." By Christmas 1995, Terry was talking about federal agents inside the building before the explosion. Not arriving after, inside, already there, like they'd been waiting. "I saw 3 men in ATF jackets on the 2nd floor," he told me. "They were taking photographs of something. This was maybe 10 minutes after the blast. But here's the thing, the stairwell they came down from was completely blocked by debris. Had been since the explosion. So how'd they get up there?" I didn't have an answer for that. There's another way into that building, Terry continued. Has to be, and they knew about it. January 1996. That's when I started noticing my own phone acting strange. Clicks and delays. Conversations that felt like they had extra ears listening. I'd always dismissed Terry's paranoia as trauma-induced hypervigilance, but suddenly I wasn't so sure. The breaking point came when I tried to access security footage from police headquarters. Routine request. I was working on an unrelated case and needed to review some tape from the week of the bombing. The footage wasn't there. Not erased, not corrupted. Gone. Like it had never existed. Maintenance issue, the tech told me. System crashed that whole week. We lost everything. But I'd seen that footage myself right after the bombing. Watched Terry coming and going, noted the federal agents who'd visited our station. Now it was all gone. Terry wasn't surprised when I told him. They're cleaning house, he said, getting rid of anything that doesn't fit their story. That's when he showed me the real evidence, the stuff he'd been keeping in his safety deposit box. Copies of witness statements that had been revised by federal agents. Photographs of explosive residue patterns that didn't match a single truck bomb. Audio recordings of radio transmissions that were missing from official logs. Look at this, Terry said, pointing to a photograph of the building's interior. See that support column? According to the FBI, the truck bomb outside should have caused the progressive collapse we saw. But look at the blast pattern. I looked. The column showed signs of damage from the inside out, not outside in. That's not from a truck bomb in the street, Terry continued. That's from charges placed inside the building. Jesus, Terry, you're talking about... I'm talking about a coordinated attack using Timothy McVeigh as a patsy. Someone wanted that building to come down and they wanted it to look like domestic terrorism. The recordings were even more damning. Radio chatter from that morning that captured federal agents coordinating movements inside the building, while local responders were still trying to establish a perimeter outside. Agent Rodriguez, third floor is clear for sweep. Copy that. Package is secure. Moving to extraction point Alpha. Package? I asked. That's what I want to know, Terry said. What package? And why were they extracting it while people were still trapped in the rubble? By February, Terry was talking about taking his evidence to the Department of Justice. He'd made contact with someone, he wouldn't tell me who worked in internal affairs. Someone who could be trusted to investigate without alerting the wrong people. I'm going to Washington next month, he told me. Going to hand-deliver everything. That's when the real harassment started. Terry's car was vandalised 3 times in 2 weeks. His apartment building's fire alarm went off at 3 a.m. every night for a week. Maintenance could never find the problem. He started getting followed by cars with government plates. They want me to know they're watching, he said. Want me to get scared and back off. But Terry wasn't backing off. If anything, the intimidation made him more determined. I pulled 4 people out of that building, he told me. 4 lives. I held a little girl while she died because the ceiling came down on her before I could get her out. If there's a chance that her death was part of some government operation, I owe it to her to find out. The medal ceremony was rescheduled for May 8th, 1996. The mayor's office wanted to coordinate with national media. Terry's story had gained attention, and they wanted to capitalise on the positive publicity. Terry told them he wasn't sure he could attend. Bad timing, he said when they pressed him. I might be travelling. On May 6th, Terry called in sick to work. Said he had the flu, but his neighbour saw him leaving his apartment that morning carrying a large envelope and a small suitcase. He looked nervous, the neighbour would tell police later. Kept checking over his shoulder. That was the last time anyone saw Terrance Yeakey alive. May 8th, 1996. The day Terry was supposed to receive his medal for heroism. Instead, his body was found in a field outside El Reno, 40 miles west of Oklahoma City. I got the call at 6 a.m. Captain Morrison's voice was flat, professional. We found Yeakey. You need to get down here. The scene was wrong from the moment I arrived. Terry's car was parked on a dirt road, doors unlocked, keys in the ignition. But his body was more than a mile away, across rough terrain dotted with barbed wire and thick brush. The official cause of death was suicide. But I've seen suicides. This wasn't one. Terry's wrist had been slashed, deep cuts that went to the bone. His arms were lacerated with dozens of smaller wounds. There were ligature marks around his neck, like he'd been strangled or hanged, and finally a single gunshot wound to the head. "Hell of a way to kill yourself," the coroner muttered, more to himself than to anyone else. The investigator in charge was FBI agent Sarah Chen. I'd never seen her before the bombing, but she'd been assigned to several OKC-related cases since then. "Clear case of suicide," she announced before the forensics team had even finished processing the scene. Officer Yeakey was obviously distraught about what he witnessed during the bombing. PTSD, guilt over not saving more people. He drove out here to end his suffering. "With what gun?" I asked. Agent Chen looked annoyed. "What? You said he shot himself. Where's the weapon?" "We're still processing the scene. They never found a gun. Not that day. Not ever." "So he slashed his wrists, cut up his arms, somehow strangled himself, walked a mile through rough terrain while bleeding out, then shot himself in the head with a gun that disappeared," I said to Agent Chen. "Stranger things have happened." But they hadn't. Not in 20 years of police work. The blood evidence told a different story. There was no blood trail from the car to where Terry's body was found. If he'd cut his wrists at the car and walked that distance, there should have been a clear path of blood drops. Instead, the first blood was found about 50 yards from the body. Like he was carried or dragged most of the way, the forensics photographer told me quietly, but don't quote me on that. Terry's family was devastated and confused. His ex-wife Tonya insisted he'd never talked about suicide. His sister said he'd seemed excited about something recently, not depressed. "He called me 2 days ago," Tonya told investigators. "Said he was finally going to get some answers, that people were going to know the truth." The official investigation lasted exactly 1 week. Agent Chen concluded that Officer Terrance Yeakey had killed himself due to severe PTSD related to his experiences during the Oklahoma City bombing response. Case closed. But when Terry's family went to collect his personal effects from his apartment, they found it had already been cleaned out. Federal agents had been there first. Said they were looking for evidence related to his mental state, Tonya was told, for the investigation. Terry's safety deposit box was also emptied. The bank manager said federal agents had presented a court order. When Terry's lawyer requested a copy of the order, he was told it was sealed for national security reasons. "Everything's gone," Terry's sister called to tell me. "His files, his photographs, his journals, they took everything." Even his service weapon was missing from the evidence room. The gun that should have been logged and secured when his body was found was nowhere to be found. Clerical error, I was told when I asked about it. Sometimes things get misfiled. The ones who claimed to protect us cleaned up before we could ask why he died. At Terry's funeral, I counted at least 6 federal agents in attendance. They didn't participate in the service, just watched from the back, taking notes, recording who came, who spoke, who seemed upset or angry. Agent Chen approached me afterward. Officer Yeakey was obviously troubled, she said. Sometimes good cops get too deep into conspiracy theories, start seeing connections that aren't there. It's a tragedy, but it happens. What about his evidence? What evidence? We didn't find any evidence, just the confused notes of a man suffering from severe psychological trauma. That night I went to Terry's bank, told them I was his partner, investigating his death. The safety deposit box attendant was nervous. "Those federal agents," she said quietly. "They were here before we even heard about Officer Yeakey's death. How'd they know to come here if he'd just been found?" I didn't have an answer for that either. It's been 28 years since Terry died. 28 years since my friend and fellow officer was found dead in a field, with wounds that told a story the government didn't want anyone to read. I'm retired now, moved away from Oklahoma City in 2003, changed my name in 2008. I tell people I'm paranoid, and maybe I am, but I'm alive, which is more than I can say for several people who asked too many questions about April 19th, 1995. Terry wasn't the only first responder who started asking uncomfortable questions about the bombing. Officer Gordon Martin died in a car accident in 1997, a single vehicle crash, no witnesses. Paramedic James Norris died of a heart attack in 1998, age 34, no history of heart problems. Fire Captain Jeff Kautzman committed suicide in 2000, according to the official report, though his family insisted he'd never shown signs of depression. All of them had been at the Murrah building that morning. All of them had seen things that didn't match the official story. I kept quiet for a long time, told myself that Terry's death really had been suicide, that my suspicions were just grief and paranoia. But time has a way of clarifying things, and the older I get, the more certain I become that my friend was murdered for what he knew. The Oklahoma City bombing was the worst domestic terrorist attack in American history until 9/11. It changed how we think about security, about government buildings, about the threat of homegrown extremism. It justified new laws, new powers, new levels of surveillance. But what if the official story is wrong? What if Terry was right about federal involvement? What if Timothy McVeigh was just the visible part of a larger operation? I've spent decades thinking about what Terry found in that building, the evidence he collected, the photographs that showed federal agents in places they shouldn't have been, at times that didn't make sense. In his final weeks, Terry talked about a package that federal agents had extracted from the building while rescue operations were still ongoing, something they'd gone in to retrieve while people were still trapped in the rubble. What was worth more than human lives? Files, maybe, evidence of other operations or people, informants, assets, agents who needed to be extracted before their covers were blown. The ATF had offices in the Murrah building. So did the FBI, the DEA, and the Secret Service. All agencies that conduct classified operations, maintain sensitive files, run informant networks. If you wanted to destroy evidence of government wrongdoing, a terrorist attack would be perfect cover. Blame the destruction on Timothy McVeigh. Use the tragedy to justify expanded powers and eliminate anyone who saw too much. Terry saw too much. I think about him often, especially on April 19th each year. I think about the man who ran into a collapsing building to save strangers, who pulled 4 people from the rubble, who held a dying child in his arms and promised her everything would be okay. That man deserved better than to die alone in a field, tortured and murdered for trying to uncover the truth. His medal is probably sitting in some government warehouse now, alongside all the evidence they confiscated from his apartment and safety deposit box. A hero's commendation for a man they killed to keep quiet. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if Terry had just kept his mouth shut, if he'd accepted the official story and let the inconsistencies slide. He might still be alive today, retired maybe, playing with grandchildren. But that wasn't Terry. He was a cop who believed in justice, even when justice put him in danger, especially then. If there's one thing I want people to remember about Terrance Yeakey, it's that he died trying to tell the truth. In an age when truth seems increasingly negotiable, when official stories are crafted by committees and focus groups, Terry represents something pure, something honourable. He saw what he saw, he documented what he could, he asked the questions that needed asking, and they killed him for it. I've never spoken publicly about any of this before, never put these thoughts on paper. But I'm old now, and the people who silenced Terry might not care as much about silencing me. Or maybe they will, and this will be the last thing I write. If something happens to me, if I die in a car accident or have a sudden heart attack or commit suicide in some implausible way, remember that I was in good health when I wrote this. Remember that I had no reason to kill myself. Remember that I was careful. The truth about Oklahoma City died with Terry in that field outside El Reno, but questions remain. Evidence exists somewhere, and maybe, someday, someone braver than me will find it and share it with the world. Until then, we're left with the official story. Timothy McVeigh, lone wolf domestic terrorist, fertilizer bomb, 168 dead. But if Terry was right, if federal agents were inside that building before the explosion, if evidence was extracted while people died in the rubble, if the whole thing was something other than what we've been told, then we're living with a lie that cost 168 lives and continues to shape American policy today. If he killed himself, why did they erase everything he left behind? That's the question that keeps me awake at night. 28 years later, it's the question that haunts me more than any other. Terry knew something worth killing for, and now, so do you. Hello, and welcome to another late night journey with Sleep Theories. Before we begin tonight's story, I'd love to know, how was your day? Was it one of those days that felt endless? Or did it slip by like sand through your fingers? And what time is it where you are right now? Are you listening from your bedroom in Chicago as the city hums outside your window? Maybe you're in London, where dawn is still hours away. Or perhaps you're on the other side of the world in Sydney, where the sun is just beginning to rise. Wherever you are, whatever time it is, you found your way here, to this quiet corner of the internet where stories live in the space between sleep and waking. If you enjoy these late night tales that blur the line between reality and something far stranger, please consider subscribing to Sleep Theories. We're building a community of night dwellers, of people who understand that the most profound truths often emerge in darkness, whispered rather than shouted. Tonight's story comes to us from the depths of classified files and buried memories. It's about an exchange that wasn't supposed to happen, a mission that officially never existed, and the people who vanished into the stars only to return different. This is the confession of someone who kept the logs, someone who knows what really happened to those 12 Americans who walked into an alien craft in 1965 and disappeared from history. So settle in, dim the lights, and let me tell you about Project Serpo, the mission we were never meant to remember. My name is Robert Chen, and I was 23 when they handed me a folder labelled E511 Serpo. The manila envelope was thick, unmarked except for that cryptic designation stamped in red ink across the top. I remember thinking it was another routine communications protocol, maybe a new radar system or satellite uplink. I was wrong. It wasn't a code name, it was a destination. I'm 78 now and I'm dying. The doctors say I have maybe 6 weeks, maybe less. Lung cancer, they tell me, though I never smoked a day in my life. Funny how that works. 53 years I've kept my mouth shut about what I saw, what I helped make possible. 53 years of sleepless nights, of jumping at shadows, of wondering if they know that I know. But now, with death breathing down my neck, I find I don't much care about their threats anymore. This is my confession, my final transmission, you might say. If you're hearing this, then either I'm already gone or I'm about to be. Either way, someone needs to know the truth about what happened in 1965, about the 12 Americans who walked into the desert and never came home. Not really. I was stationed at Holloman Air Force Base in New Mexico, part of the 6th Communications Squadron. My job was supposed to be routine, maintaining radio equipment, handling encrypted transmissions, the usual military communications work. But in July of 1965, everything changed. That's when Colonel Harrison called me into his office and handed me that folder. "Son," he said, his voice lower than I'd ever heard it, "what I'm about to show you is classified beyond your current clearance level. You've been specially selected for a project that officially doesn't exist. You'll sign papers that say you were never here, never saw what you're about to see, and never spoke to anyone about any of it. Are we clear?" I nodded, though my hands were already shaking. At 23, you think you're ready for anything. You're not. Inside the folder were photographs, not the grainy, out-of-focus images you see in tabloids, but crystal-clear, high-resolution shots that made my blood run cold. A craft, roughly disc-shaped, but with angular protrusions, sitting in what looked like a hangar. People in hazmat suits walking around it taking measurements. And then, on the last page, a photograph that still haunts my dreams. Beings, clearly not human, standing next to what appeared to be military personnel. They were tall, thin, with large eyes and pale, almost translucent skin. Their faces were serene, almost friendly, but there was something in those dark eyes that spoke of intelligence far beyond our own. "Jesus Christ," I whispered. "He's not involved in this one, son," Colonel Harrison replied. "But they are." He tapped the photograph of the beings. "We call them the Ebons. They're from a star system called Zeta Reticuli, about 39 light-years from here, and they want to make a trade." That's how I learned about the exchange program, the deal that had been worked out in secret meetings between US officials and these visitors from another world. The Ebons would share their technology, their medical knowledge, their understanding of the universe. In return, they wanted something precious. People. Human beings who would travel to their world, live among them, study their civilization, and report back to Earth. 12 people. A carefully selected team of scientists, doctors, linguists, and military specialists. They would board an Eben craft and make the journey to Serpo, the third planet in the Zeta Reticuli system. The mission was supposed to last 10 years. When they returned, they would bring back knowledge that could advance human civilization by centuries. My job was to establish and maintain communication between the team and Earth, to build a bridge across 39 light-years of space, using technology that was half human, half alien, and entirely experimental. They gave me a team of 6 other communication specialists, all sworn to secrecy, all young enough to be moulded and old enough to be trusted. We had 11 months to prepare, 11 months to learn how to operate equipment that defied everything we knew about physics. The Ebens had provided translation devices, communication arrays that could somehow transmit faster than light, and encoding systems that used mathematical principles our best scientists barely understood. But as I learned more about the project, as I read through briefing after briefing, a cold certainty settled in my chest. We thought we were reaching out to the stars, making first contact, beginning a new chapter in human history. We didn't know we were never getting them back, not the way they left anyway. The team was impressive. Dr. Sarah Martinez, a linguist who spoke 12 languages, Captain James Morrison, a pilot with more flight hours than anyone in the Air Force, Dr. Robert Kim, a physician specialising in space medicine, Lieutenant Commander Patricia Wells, a nuclear engineer, and 8 others, each the best in their field. They were brave, brilliant, and completely unprepared for what they were walking into. I met them all during the training period. We worked together daily, testing communication protocols, running simulations, preparing for a mission that none of us truly understood. They were excited, all of them. Who wouldn't be? They were about to become the first human beings to travel to another world, to make contact with an alien civilization. They were going to be remembered forever. They were right about that last part, just not in the way they expected. The real briefing came in June of 1965, 6 weeks before the scheduled departure. They moved us to an underground facility 20 miles south of Holloman, a place that didn't exist on any map. The conference room was stark, windowless, lit by harsh fluorescent lights that cast everything in an otherworldly pallor. Appropriate, considering what we were about to discuss. General Morrison, no relation to Captain Morrison, stood at the front of the room next to a large screen. Behind him sat 3 men in dark suits whom I'd never seen before and would never see again. They didn't introduce themselves, didn't speak throughout the entire briefing. They just watched, their faces expressionless, their eyes never leaving our faces. What I'm about to tell you, General Morrison began, is the culmination of 18 years of contact with an extraterrestrial intelligence. This contact began on July 8th, 1947, near Roswell, New Mexico. A murmur went through the room. We'd all heard the rumours, the stories about crash saucers and alien bodies, but hearing it confirmed by a general officer was something else entirely. The craft that crashed contained 4 beings, 3 of whom died on impact. The 4th survived for several hours and was able to communicate with our personnel through a combination of telepathy and crude pictographs. Before it died, it gave us enough information to establish contact with its people. The screen flickered to life, showing a star chart. A red line connected our solar system to a binary star system 39 light-years away. The being was from Zeta Reticuli, a binary star system containing several inhabited worlds. The primary intelligent species, whom we've designated as the Ebens, made contact with us through radio transmissions beginning in 1952. These communications led to a series of meetings, the first of which took place in 1954 at Holloman Air Force Base. I felt a chill run down my spine. I'd been stationed at Holloman for 2 years, walked past that very landing strip hundreds of times. To think that history had been made there, that first contact with an alien intelligence had happened just miles from where I slept every night. The Ebens are a peaceful species, General Morrison continued. They've been observing Earth for several thousand years, but their policy is one of non-interference. They became concerned about our development of nuclear weapons and decided to make limited contact. The exchange program is their way of ensuring that both our species can learn from each other. Dr. Martinez raised her hand. What exactly do they want to learn from us? One of the men in suits leaned forward and whispered something to General Morrison, who nodded. They're interested in human emotion, human creativity, human individuality. Their society is highly collective, highly efficient, but they've lost something in the process. They want to understand what makes us us. And what do we get in return? Asked Captain Morrison. The General smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. Everything. Clean energy that could power our civilization for millennia. Medical technology that could eliminate disease and extend human life indefinitely. Transportation systems that could make interstellar travel as common as flying from New York to Los Angeles. They're offering us the keys to the universe. It sounded too good to be true. It was. The briefing continued for 6 hours. We learned about Serpo, the third planet in the Zeta Reticuli system. It was smaller than Earth, with a surface gravity about 90% of ours. It orbited twin suns, creating complex day-night cycles that could last for weeks. The climate was arid, but not hostile, with temperatures ranging from 40 to 110 degrees Fahrenheit. Most importantly, the atmosphere was breathable for humans, though oxygen content was slightly lower than Earth's. The Ebon civilization was ancient. They'd achieved interstellar travel over 10,000 years ago. Their society was structured around collective decision-making, with no individual leaders as we would understand them. They had no concept of money, no crime, no war. They lived in harmony with their environment and with each other, guided by principles of logic and mutual benefit. It sounded like paradise. The mission duration is 10 years, General Morrison explained. The team will live among the Ebons, study their society, their technology, their culture. Regular reports will be transmitted back to Earth using the communication systems that Specialist Chen and his team have been developing. At the end of 10 years, the team will return to Earth aboard an Ebon craft. What if something goes wrong? Asked Dr. Kim. What if someone gets sick, or injured, or... The General's expression hardened. The Ebons have assured us that their medical technology far exceeds our own. Any medical emergency can be handled using their equipment and techniques. As for other contingencies... He paused, glancing at the men in suits. The mission parameters allow for early return in case of extreme circumstances, but the Ebons have emphasized that the journey is difficult and dangerous. Multiple trips would not be advisable. That should have been our first warning. In all the excitement, all the talk of advanced technology and interstellar cooperation, we'd overlooked a crucial detail. If the Ebons could travel between star systems as easily as we flew between cities, why would multiple trips be not advisable? But we were young, and we were dazzled by the scope of what we were attempting. We didn't ask the right questions. We didn't see the warning signs. We just nodded and smiled and prepared to make history. The final part of the briefing covered communication protocols. My team would be responsible for maintaining contact between the away team and Earth. We'd been given Ebon technology, crystalline devices that could somehow transmit signals faster than light, though the exact mechanism was never explained to us. The signals would be encoded using a hybrid system that combined human mathematics with Ebon symbolic logic. The most important thing, General Morrison emphasised, is maintaining regular contact. The away team will transmit daily reports for the first year, then weekly reports for the remainder of the mission. These transmissions are vital for monitoring the team's health and well-being, and for collecting the scientific data that justifies this entire program. I raised my hand. What if we lose contact? What if something happens to the communication equipment? The General's face went pale. That cannot happen, Specialist Chen. The success of this mission, the safety of our people, depends entirely on maintaining that link. You and your team are the lifeline between those 12 brave souls and home. Don't let us down. As we filed out of the briefing room, I caught sight of one of the men in suits whispering urgently to General Morrison. I couldn't make out the words, but I heard the tone. Worried, almost frightened. It was the first crack in the facade of confidence they'd been presenting. The first hint that maybe, just maybe, they didn't have everything under control. That night, lying in my bunk, I stared at the ceiling and tried to process everything I'd learned. We were about to send 12 people to another world, 39 light years from Earth, based on the promises of beings we barely understood. The technology was alien, the risks unknown, the consequences unimaginable. But it was too late for second thoughts. The wheels were already in motion, the die already cast. In 6 weeks, 12 Americans would walk into an alien spacecraft and disappear into the night sky, and I would be their only link to home. I should have realised then that some links, once broken, can never be repaired. July 16th, 1965. The date is burned into my memory like a brand. It was a Tuesday, clear and hot, the kind of New Mexico day where the sun hammers down from a sky the colour of bleached bone. At 0300 hours we received the signal we'd been waiting for, package inbound, ETA 0400 hours. The landing site was Sector 7 of the White Sands testing range, a remote area surrounded by mountains and accessible only by military transport. I rode out there in a convoy of unmarked vehicles, my communication equipment packed in radiation-shielded cases in the back of my truck. The away team travelled separately, in a bus with tinted windows like prisoners being transported to their execution. When we arrived at the site, I was struck by how ordinary it looked. Just a flat stretch of desert, marked by a circle of bright lights and surrounded by military personnel. There were maybe 50 people there, scientists, officials, photographers documenting everything for posterity. Or at least that's what they told us. At exactly 0400 hours, the sky above us began to shimmer. I've tried to describe what happened next 1,000 times over the years, and I've never found words that do it justice. The craft didn't appear so much as it materialised, like reality itself was shifting to accommodate its presence. One moment there was empty sky, the next there was a vessel roughly the size of a small building, hovering 30 feet above the ground without making a sound. It wasn't the classic flying saucer shape you see in movies. This thing was more angular, almost crystalline in structure, with surfaces that seemed to shift and flow like liquid metal. Lights pulsed along its edges in patterns that hurt to look at directly, as if they were operating on frequencies human eyes weren't designed to perceive. The craft settled to the ground with impossible grace, touching down on what appeared to be 4 slender legs that extended from its underside. A section of the hull simply vanished. Not opened, not slid aside, just ceased to exist, revealing an interior bathed in soft blue-white light. 3 ebons emerged from the craft. Seeing them in photographs was one thing. Seeing them in person was something else entirely. They were tall, perhaps 6.5 feet, with elongated limbs and torsos. Their skin was pale grey, almost translucent, and seemed to glow faintly in the desert darkness. Their heads were proportionally larger than humans, dominated by enormous dark eyes that seemed to hold depths beyond measure. But it was their movement that really unsettled me. They glided rather than walked, their feet barely seeming to touch the ground, and they moved in perfect synchronization, as if they were parts of a single organism rather than 3 separate beings. One of them, I could never tell them apart, which may have been intentional, approached General Morrison and extended a long 4-fingered hand. They touched briefly, and I saw the General's eyes widen as if he'd received some kind of shock. When they separated, the Ebon turned toward the away team and made a gesture that could have been a greeting or a summoning. The 12 stepped forward. I watched them walk across that circle of light, their faces a mixture of excitement and terror. Dr. Martinez was trembling visibly. Captain Morrison kept his military bearing, but his face was pale as chalk. Dr. Kim clutched his medical bag like a lifeline. They reached the edge of the craft's entrance and stopped. For a moment, nobody moved. I could hear the desert wind whistling across the sand, the distant hum of generators powering the floodlights. Then Dr. Martinez turned back toward us and raised her hand in a small wave. "See you in 10 years," she called out, her voice carrying clearly in the thin air. Those were the last words any of them spoke on Earth. One by one they walked into the craft. The Ebons followed them inside. For perhaps 30 seconds nothing happened. Then that section of hull materialized again, sealing them in. The craft rose silently into the air, gaining altitude with impossible speed. Within moments it was just a point of light among the stars. Then it was gone entirely, leaving nothing but the taste of ozone in the air and the memory of something that defied every law of physics we thought we understood. "Well, gentlemen," General Morrison said, his voice steady despite the sweat beading on his forehead, "now we wait." We didn't have to wait long for the first transmission. The first message came through 6 hours after departure, crackling through our alien communication equipment like a voice from another dimension. I was in the comm shack, monitoring the frequencies we'd been given, when the crystalline transmitter suddenly blazed with light. "Earth Base, this is Away Team 1. We have achieved..." Jesus Christ, you have to see this! Dr. Martinez's voice, but distorted, stretched thin by distance and alien technology. There was awe in her tone, and something else, something that might have been fear. "Away Team 1, this is Earth Base. Please report your status and position. We're in transit. The craft, it's not what we expected. It's larger inside than outside, if that makes any sense. The walls are alive. They pulse like a heartbeat. And the Ebons, they don't speak the way we do. They touch your mind." Static washed over the transmission, and when it cleared, Dr. Martinez's voice was more controlled, more professional. "Correction, Earth Base. Communication with our hosts is proceeding normally. All team members are in good health. We estimate arrival at destination in approximately 72 Earth hours." Something had changed in those few seconds of static. The wonder and fear in her voice had been replaced by a clinical detachment that chilled me to the bone. I made a note in the log. First transmission. Anomalous behaviour pattern observed. Over the next 3 days we received regular updates from the away team. They described the interior of the craft in increasingly technical terms, as if they were reading from a prepared script. The sense of personality, of individual human voices began to fade from their transmissions. By the time they reached Serpo, they sounded more like recording devices than people. "Earth Base, this is Away Team 1. We have achieved orbital insertion around the target planet. Surface appears to be arid, with extensive city structures visible from orbit. Atmospheric composition is within acceptable parameters for human habitation. Preparing for surface landing." That was the last we heard from them for 6 weeks. When contact resumed, everything had changed. The voices that came through our equipment were still recognizably human, but there was something wrong with them. They spoke too slowly, with odd pauses between words, as if they were translating their thoughts from another language before speaking. "Earth Base, this is Dr. Martinez. We have established residence in the primary settlement. The Ebon social structure is fascinating. They operate as a collective consciousness while maintaining individual identities. It is harmonious. Dr. Martinez, this is Earth Base. Please provide details on living conditions, local environment, and team health status. All parameters are acceptable. The binary star system creates complex illumination cycles, currently experiencing extended daylight period, duration approximately 14 Earth days, temperature range suitable for human habitation. Local architecture is organic in nature." I leaned into the microphone. "Dr. Martinez, this is Specialist Chen. How are you feeling? How is the team adapting?" Another pause, longer this time. "Adaptation is proceeding. The Ebons are helpful. They provide guidance, knowledge, understanding. We are learning much." Something in her tone made my skin crawl. It wasn't just the stilted speech pattern, it was the complete absence of emotion. Dr. Martinez had been one of the most expressive people I'd ever met, animated and passionate about her work. The voice coming through the transmitter sounded hollow, as if it belonged to a completely different person. Over the following months, the transmissions continued to arrive on schedule, but they became increasingly strange. The away team reported on Ebon society, their technology, their history, but always in the same flat, emotionless tone. They described wonders that should have amazed them, cities that grew like living organisms, transportation systems that moved people through solid matter, energy sources that drew power directly from space-time itself, but they might as well have been reading a grocery list. And then there were the things they weren't supposed to talk about. In month 8, during what should have been a routine status report, Captain Morrison's voice suddenly broke through with genuine emotion for the first time in months. Earthbase, this is Morrison. There's something they don't want us to see. A structure, about 20 kilometres from the settlement. Black pyramid, maybe 300 metres tall. When we ask about it, they change the subject. But at night, when the sun's set, you can see lights moving around it. And sounds. Christ, the sounds that come from that place. Static exploded from the transmitter, so loud and harsh that I had to tear off my headphones. When it cleared, Morrison's voice was back to that same flat monotone. Correction, Earthbase. Previous transmission contained errors. No anomalous structures observed. Local geography is uniformly consistent with previous reports. Team status remains optimal. I stared at the transmitter, my hands shaking. Whatever had just happened, whoever had been speaking in those few seconds of genuine emotion, it hadn't been the same person who'd corrected the transmission. That was when I started keeping my own logs, separate from the official reports. Something was wrong on Serpo. Something the away team couldn't or wouldn't talk about. And I was beginning to suspect that our hosts weren't as benevolent as they claimed to be. The transmissions continued for 2 more years, but they became less frequent and more disturbing. The away team reported on their studies, their integration into Eben society, their growing understanding of alien technology. But between the lines, in the pauses, and the occasional slip of genuine emotion, another story emerged. In month 18, Dr. Kim mentioned medical procedures that were being performed on the team. When pressed for details, he claimed they were routine health monitoring. But something in his voice suggested otherwise. In month 24, Lieutenant Wells described power sources that required biological components, but couldn't explain what those components were. In month 30, Dr. Martinez transmitted a single word in what sounded like an alien language, then claimed it was a transmission error, and throughout it all, that black pyramid haunted the edges of their reports. They never mentioned it directly again, but sometimes I could hear something in their voices, fear, perhaps, or recognition of something they weren't allowed to acknowledge. The last transmission we received from the full-away team came in month 36, exactly 3 years after departure. Dr. Martinez's voice, if it was still her voice, delivered what sounded like a prepared statement. Earthbase, this is away Team 1. Mission parameters are being adjusted. Some team members are transitioning to extended research assignments. Communication protocols will be modified accordingly. Do not be concerned if transmission frequency decreases. Away Team 1, please clarify the nature of these adjustments. What do you mean by extended research assignments? The pause was so long I thought we'd lost the signal entirely. When the voice returned, it was barely recognisable as human. Some questions cannot be answered. Some knowledge cannot be shared. We are where we need to be. We're doing what we need to do. That is sufficient. After that, we heard from only one member of the away team, someone who claimed to be Captain Morrison, though the voice was so distorted by distance and alien interference that identification was impossible. His transmissions came sporadically, sometimes months apart, and consisted mainly of technical data about Eben technology and society. But in his final transmission, received in month 47, he broke protocol one last time. All parameters are acceptable. The binary star system creates complex illumination cycles, currently experiencing extended daylight period, duration approximately 14 Earth days, temperature range suitable for human habitation. Local architecture is organic in nature. I leaned into the microphone. Dr. Martinez, this is Specialist Chen. How are you feeling? How is the team adapting? Another pause, longer this time. Adaptation is proceeding. The Ebens are helpful. They provide guidance, knowledge, understanding. We are learning much. Something in her tone made my skin crawl. It wasn't just the stilted speech pattern. It was the complete absence of emotion. Dr. Martinez had been one of the most expressive people I'd ever met, animated and passionate about her work. The voice coming through the transmitter sounded hollow, as if it belonged to a completely different person. Over the following months, the transmissions continued to arrive on schedule, but they became increasingly strange. The away team reported on Ebon society, their technology, their history, but always in the same flat, emotionless tone. They described wonders that should have amazed them, cities that grew like living organisms, transportation systems that moved people through solid matter, energy sources that drew power directly from space-time itself, but they might as well have been reading a grocery list. And then there were the things they weren't supposed to talk about. In month 8, during what should have been a routine status report, Captain Morrison's voice suddenly broke through with genuine emotion for the first time in months. "Earthbase, this is Morrison. There's something they don't want us to see. A structure, about 20 kilometres from the settlement. Black pyramid, maybe 300 metres tall. When we ask about it, they change the subject. But at night, when the sun's set, you can see lights moving around it. And sounds. Christ, the sounds that come from that place." Static exploded from the transmitter, so loud and harsh that I had to tear off my headphones. When it cleared, Morrison's voice was back to that same flat monotone. "Correction, Earthbase. Previous transmission contained errors. No anomalous structures observed. Local geography is uniformly consistent with previous reports. Team status remains optimal." I stared at the transmitter, my hands shaking. Whatever had just happened, whoever had been speaking in those few seconds of genuine emotion, it hadn't been the same person who'd corrected the transmission. That was when I started keeping my own logs, separate from the official reports. Something was wrong on Serpo. Something the away team couldn't or wouldn't talk about. And I was beginning to suspect that our hosts weren't as benevolent as they claimed to be. The transmissions continued for 2 more years, but they became less frequent and more disturbing. The away team reported on their studies, their integration into Ebon society, their growing understanding of alien technology. But between the lines, in the pauses, and the occasional slip of genuine emotion, another story emerged. In month 18, Dr. Kim mentioned medical procedures that were being performed on the team. When pressed for details, he claimed they were routine health monitoring. But something in his voice suggested otherwise. In month 24, Lieutenant Wells described power sources that required biological components, but couldn't explain what those components were. In month 30, Dr. Martinez transmitted a single word in what sounded like an alien language, then claimed it was a transmission error, and throughout it all, that black pyramid haunted the edges of their reports. They never mentioned it directly again, but sometimes I could hear something in their voices, fear, perhaps, or recognition of something they weren't allowed to acknowledge. The last transmission we received from the full-away team came in month 36, exactly 3 years after departure. Dr. Martinez's voice, if it was still her voice, delivered what sounded like a prepared statement. "Earth Base, this is away Team 1. Mission parameters are being adjusted. Some team members are transitioning to extended research assignments. Communication protocols will be modified accordingly. Do not be concerned if transmission frequency decreases. Away Team 1, please clarify the nature of these adjustments. What do you mean by extended research assignments?" The pause was so long I thought we'd lost the signal entirely. When the voice returned, it was barely recognizable as human. Some questions cannot be answered. Some knowledge cannot be shared. We are where we need to be. We're doing what we need to do. That is sufficient. After that, we heard from only one member of the away team, someone who claimed to be Captain Morrison, though the voice was so distorted by distance and alien interference that identification was impossible. His transmissions came sporadically, sometimes months apart, and consisted mainly of technical data about Ebon technology and society. But in his final transmission, received in month 47, he broke protocol one last time. 6 months after the return, the 8 survivors were given new identities and relocated to different parts of the country. Officially, they had never existed. The mission had never happened. Project Serpo was sealed in vaults beneath the Pentagon, buried under layers of classification that would ensure it never saw the light of day. But I kept watching them, the returnees. I made it my business to know where they were, how they were doing, and what I found disturbed me more than anything else. They were all brilliant, not just intelligent, they had always been that, but brilliant in ways that transcended human understanding. Dr. Martinez, the linguist, began writing papers on theoretical communication that were decades ahead of their time. Captain Morrison, the pilot, designed aircraft propulsion systems that NASA wouldn't develop for another 20 years. Dr. Kim, the physician, made breakthroughs in cellular biology that revolutionized medicine. It was as if their time on Serpo had given them access to knowledge far beyond human comprehension. But the cost was evident in their hollow eyes, their haunted expressions, their tendency to stare at the sky as if waiting for something to come for them. 3 of them committed suicide within 5 years of their return. 2 more died in what were officially ruled accidents, but looked suspiciously like murders. The remaining 3 disappeared entirely, vanishing from their new lives without a trace. Only Dr. Kim lived long enough to make contact with me, and that was 25 years later, in 2003. He called me at my home in Virginia, his voice barely recognizable but still carrying that same tone of quiet desperation I'd heard in the desert. "Chen," he said, "I remember now. Some of it, anyway. And you need to know. We weren't the first to go, and we weren't the last to come back changed." The line went dead. 2 days later, Dr. Kim was found dead in his apartment, apparently from a heart attack. But the coroner noted something unusual in his preliminary report, something that was quickly classified and removed from the official record. Doctor. Kim's brain showed signs of surgical alteration, as if someone had carefully removed specific neural pathways with inhuman precision. I tried to investigate further, but doors that had once been open to me were suddenly closed. My security clearance was revoked. My Pentagon position was terminated due to budget constraints. And I began to notice things. Cars following me, phones tapping out strange rhythms, electronic devices in my home turning on and off by themselves. They were watching me. They knew I knew. And they were making it clear that my continued health depended on my continued silence. So I stayed quiet. For 20 more years I stayed quiet. Until now. The erasure was methodical, thorough, and absolutely ruthless. Within 6 months of the returnees debriefing, Project Serpo ceased to exist in any official capacity. Files were shredded, hard drives wiped, personnel reassigned or retired. Anyone who had been involved in the project received visits from men in dark suits who explained, very politely, that discussing their work would be considered an act of treason. I was lucky, if you can call it luck. My role had been peripheral enough that I warranted only a single visit. 2 men arrived at my apartment in Arlington on a Tuesday evening in March 1979. They were polite, professional, and absolutely terrifying in their quiet certainty. "Mr. Chen," the older one said, settling into my living room chair as if he owned it, "we understand you were involved in certain communications projects during your time at Holloman Air Force Base." "I'm not sure what you're referring to," I replied, though my mouth was dry as sand. The younger man smiled. "Of course you're not, because those projects never existed. The equipment you operated was standard military communication gear. The transmissions you monitored were routine training exercises. The people you think you remember never went anywhere. And if I were to suggest otherwise?" The older man's expression didn't change, but something shifted in his eyes, something cold and predatory. "Then you would be suffering from delusions brought on by stress and extended exposure to high-frequency radiation. You would require immediate psychiatric evaluation and long-term treatment in a secure facility. Your family would be very concerned about your mental health." The threat was subtle but unmistakable. I nodded slowly. "I understand," I said. "Good." The older man stood, straightening his tie. "We're glad we could clear up any confusion. Have a pleasant evening, Mr. Chen." They left as quietly as they had arrived, but their message was crystal clear. Forget what you saw, forget what you heard, forget that any of it ever happened, or disappear. Most people took the hint. Most people valued their lives more than their consciences, but a few didn't. A few tried to speak out, tried to reveal the truth about what had happened in the desert that night in 1965, and they didn't last long. Dr. James Morrison, Not the captain who had gone to Serpo, but a physicist who had been part of the preliminary team analysing Eben technology, was found dead in his hotel room in Las Vegas in 1980. Heart attack, the coroner said, though Morrison was only 42 and in perfect health. The physicist's notes and research materials vanished from his room before the police arrived. Lieutenant Colonel Sarah Hayes, who had been part of the security detail during the exchange, died in a car accident in 1982. Her car went off a bridge in broad daylight on a clear, dry road. Investigators found evidence of brake failure, but the brake lines had been severed with surgical precision. Master Sergeant Robert Torres, one of the other communication specialists on my team, simply disappeared in 1984. He was there when his wife went to bed, gone when she woke up. No signs of struggle, no evidence of foul play, no trace of where he might have gone. The official investigation concluded that he had suffered a mental breakdown and wandered off into the desert. His body was never found. The pattern was clear. Anyone who knew too much, anyone who might be tempted to talk, was being systematically eliminated, and the people doing the eliminating were very good at making it look like natural causes or accidents. But I had something the others didn't. I had kept records. During those years of monitoring transmissions from Serpo, I had made copies of everything. Not official copies, not anything that would show up in a government audit, but personal backups stored on magnetic tape and hidden in places only I knew about. The original logs, the ones that went into the official files, had been sanitized. Anything too strange, too disturbing, too revealing had been edited out or marked as transmission errors. But my copies contained everything. Every anomalous report, every break in protocol, every moment when the real truth had leaked through the carefully constructed facade, including the final transmission. The official records showed that communication with the away team ceased in month 47, when the last technical data packet was received from Captain Morrison. But that wasn't true. There was one more transmission, received 3 days before the ship's return. It came through on an emergency frequency, lasted exactly 97 seconds, and contained information that made my blood run cold. The voice was human, but so distorted by distance and alien interference that individual identification was impossible. It might have been Morrison, or Martinez, or one of the others, or it might have been someone else entirely, someone who had found a way to access their communication equipment. Earthbase. This is anyone who can hear this. I don't have much time. They know I'm using their equipment. The others are gone. Not dead. Changed. Transformed into something else. Something that serves them. The pyramid. God, the pyramid. It's not a building, it's a machine. A processing centre. They take people inside, people like us, and they harvest something. Memories, maybe. Consciousness. Soul. I don't know what to call it. But that's not the worst part. The worst part is what they put back. The worst part is what comes out wearing your face, speaking with your voice, carrying your memories but serving their purposes. They're coming back. Some of them anyway. The ones who were compatible. They look like us, they'll act like us, but they're not us anymore. They're scouts, advance agents, preparing the way for something bigger. If you're listening to this, if anyone is listening, you need to know. The exchange was never about learning. It was about infiltration. And it's working. Dear God, it's working. The transmission ended in a burst of static so violent it burned out half my equipment. When I tried to re-establish contact, there was nothing but silence. I sat in that communication shack for the rest of the night, staring at the dead equipment and trying to process what I'd heard. If the transmission was genuine, and everything about it suggested it was, then the 8 people who returned from Serpo weren't really the original crew members. They were something else, something that had been created using the crew's memories and personalities as templates, which meant the real away team was still on Serpo, or they were dead, or they were something worse than dead. I made a copy of that final transmission and hid it with the rest of my records. Then I destroyed the original and filed a report stating that the equipment had malfunctioned due to a power surge. The official record would show nothing unusual had happened that night, but I knew better, and I spent the next 44 years watching, waiting, and wondering what had really come back from the stars. My name is Robert Chen, and if you're hearing this, then I'm already gone. The lung cancer they told me about 6 months ago isn't really cancer. It's something else. Something that's been growing inside me since I handled that alien communication equipment all those years ago. The doctors can't explain it. Tumours that pulse in rhythm with radio frequencies, cells that have been altered on a genetic level by exposure to technology we were never meant to touch. But I'm not the only one. Over the past 5 years, I've tracked down 17 other people who were involved in Project Serpo. Communication specialists, security personnel, scientists who analyse the alien technology. 16 of them are dead now, all from aggressive cancers that defy conventional treatment. The 17th is in a secure psychiatric facility, claiming that his dreams are being broadcast to him from the Zeta Reticuli system. We were contaminated, all of us, infected by something that came through those crystalline transmitters, something that's been slowly changing us from the inside out. And now that the process is nearly complete, now that we're all dying or dead, they don't need to maintain the cover-up anymore. The truth is coming out. 3 weeks ago, someone leaked classified documents to a conspiracy website called Serpo.org. The documents contain detailed information about the exchange program, including personnel rosters, mission briefings, and selected transmission logs. The information was too accurate, too detailed to be dismissed as fiction. But it was also sanitized, edited to remove the most disturbing elements of what really happened. The leak was deliberate. They want the story to come out now, but they want it to come out their way, with their spin, their interpretation of events. They're calling it a successful diplomatic mission, a triumph of interspecies cooperation. They're painting the Ebons as benevolent teachers who shared their knowledge freely and asked for nothing in return except understanding. It's all lies. The real story is in the files I've hidden, in the recordings I've kept, in the transmission logs that were never supposed to survive. And now, with my time running out, I'm finally ready to tell it. The exchange program didn't end in 1978. It's still going on. Every few years, another group of people disappears. Scientists, military personnel, civilians with specific skills or knowledge. They're not kidnapped. They volunteer, lured by promises of advanced technology and cosmic knowledge. But they don't know what happened to their predecessors. They don't know about the pyramid, about the processing centre, about what the Ebons really want from us. And the people who come back, they're not the same people who left. They're something new, something engineered, something designed to look and act human while serving an alien agenda. They're scattered throughout our society now, in government, in the military, in academia, in the private sector. They're watching, waiting, preparing for the next phase of whatever plan the Ebons have for our world. I've been having dreams lately. Dreams of symbols that burn themselves into my mind, of voices speaking in languages that predate human speech, of a black pyramid rising from red sand under the light of twin suns, and in these dreams I can hear them calling to me, promising knowledge, promising understanding, promising an end to the pain that's been eating away at me for 44 years. But I know what that promise really means. I know what waits at the top of that pyramid. 2 nights ago, I woke up to find symbols carved into my bedroom wall. The same symbols Dr. Martinez had drawn during her debriefing. The same patterns that had hurt to look at back then and burn my eyes now. I don't remember carving them. I don't remember getting out of bed. But there they were, cut deep into the drywall with inhuman precision. They're calling me home. I won't go. I won't let them finish what they started all those years ago when I first touched their equipment, first heard their voices whispering across the void. I've prepared for this moment, stockpiled enough medication to ensure that when my time comes, it comes on my terms. But before I go, I have one last duty to perform, one final transmission to send. I've uploaded everything, all the files, all the recordings, all the evidence, to a server in Iceland. The data is encrypted and set to release automatically in 72 hours. When it does, the world will finally know the truth about Project Serpo, about the exchange program, about the things that came back wearing human faces. They'll try to discredit it, of course. They'll call it the ramblings of a dying man, the fantasies of someone driven mad by guilt and radiation exposure. But some people will listen. Some people will look at the evidence and see the patterns, connect the dots, understand what's really happening, and maybe, just maybe, they'll be ready when the Evans decide it's time for the next phase of their plan. The stars aren't silent. They never were. They're watching, waiting, planning. And we're not in control of the exchange anymore. We never were. I can hear them now, calling to me through the static of my old radio. The same voices I heard 44 years ago, speaking in harmonies that resonate in my bones. They're telling me it's time to come home, time to take my place in their grand design. But I remember what Morrison said in that final transmission. We weren't the first to go, and we weren't the last to come back changed. I won't be changed. I won't be processed. I won't be turned into another scout, another agent, another tool in their infiltration of our world. My name is Robert Chen. I was a communications specialist with the United States Air Force, stationed at Holloman Air Force Base in New Mexico. I helped establish contact with beings from the Zeta Reticuli system. I monitored transmissions from 12 Americans who travelled to their world and never really came home. This is my final transmission. My last message to a world that doesn't know it's already been invaded, already been compromised, already been marked for something far worse than conquest. The exchange is real, the infiltration is happening, and time is running out. Remember what I've told you. Remember the Black Pyramid. Remember that not everything that looks human really is human. And remember that some exchanges can never be undone. The stars are calling. But I'm not going home. Not their home anyway. Static fills the recording for several seconds, then cuts to silence. This transmission was discovered on a server in Reykjavik, Iceland, along with 847 classified documents related to Project Serpo. Robert Chen's body was found in his Virginia apartment 3 days later, dead from an apparent medication overdose. The cause of death was listed as suicide, but investigating officers noted that his bedroom wall contained complex geometric symbols carved into the drywall with surgical precision. The symbols were photographed and classified, then removed from the official police report. Chen's medical records, obtained through a Freedom of Information Act request, revealed that his lung cancer was unlike any pathology on record. The tumorous growths showed signs of artificial manipulation and contained trace elements not found naturally on Earth. The records were sealed by order of the Department of Defense before independent analysis could be completed. As of this writing, 17 other individuals connected to Project Serpo have died under similar circumstances. All showed signs of the same anomalous cellular alteration found in Chen's body. All reported unusual dreams and behavioural changes in the months before their deaths. The server containing Chen's files was destroyed by unknown parties 6 hours after this recording was recovered. No copies are known to exist. Official position of the United States government. Project Serpo never existed. Any documents claiming otherwise are elaborate hoaxes created by conspiracy theorists and foreign disinformation campaigns. No comment was available from the Department of Defense, NASA, or the Air Force regarding the contents of this recording. The search for truth continues. Hello, fellow seekers of the strange and unexplained. Before we begin tonight's journey into the shadows of history, I want to take a moment to connect with you, wherever you might be listening to this. How was your day today? I hope it treated you kindly. What time is it where you are right now? Are you settling in for the night, perhaps with the soft glow of a bedside lamp? Or maybe you're listening in the early morning hours when the world feels most mysterious. And where in this vast world are you tuning in from? Whether you're in a bustling city or a quiet rural town, know that you're part of our global community of truth seekers. If you're new to sleep theories, welcome to our family of night wanderers and mystery lovers. We explore the stories that linger in the shadows of official history, the cases that were buried, the witnesses who were silenced, and the truths that powerful people would prefer remained forgotten. If tonight's story resonates with you, please consider subscribing. Your support helps us continue bringing these hidden truths to light, one whispered tale at a time. Now settle in, turn down the lights, let the outside world fade away. Tonight I'm sharing something that was never meant to be shared, a story passed down through blood and sworn to secrecy for over 50 years. This is the story of my Uncle Stefan, The man the world knew as the Falcon Lake witness. But what the world doesn't know, what they were never allowed to know, changes everything. My name is Mark Krawczyk. This is my final testimony before I disappear forever. My uncle never drank again after Falcon Lake. Not because he found God, or discovered some new philosophy of clean living. Stefan Michalak stopped drinking because alcohol made the line between reality and nightmare too thin. And after what happened to him in those Manitoba woods on May 20th, 1967, he could never again afford to question what was real. Growing up in Winnipeg in the 1970s, I heard the whispers at family gatherings, hushed conversations that would stop the moment a child entered the room, references to the burned man in the woods and what really happened to Stefan. My parents, his sister and brother-in-law would exchange those loaded glances that adults think children don't notice. But I noticed everything. I was 15 when I first saw the documents. It was Christmas Eve, 1978. The adults were deep in their cups, all except Uncle Stefan, who sat quietly in his chair, nursing the same cup of coffee he'd been holding for hours. I'd gone upstairs to use the bathroom in his house, but curiosity led me to his study instead. The door was usually locked, but that night, perhaps loosened by the holiday spirit or simply forgotten in the chaos of family gathering, it stood slightly ajar. Inside, papers were scattered across his desk like autumn leaves. But these weren't ordinary documents. They had official letterheads. RCMP. Department of National Defense, something called Project Blue Book from the United States Air Force. I saw photocopied medical reports with burned flesh that made my stomach turn. Radiation readings that meant nothing to my teenage mind but somehow felt ominous. And sketches. God, those sketches! Detailed drawings of what looked like a submarine standing on end, with precise measurements and notes written in Stefan's careful handwriting. But it wasn't the craft itself that made my blood run cold. It was the figures he'd drawn beside it. Two humanoid shapes in what appeared to be protective suits, their faces obscured, but their posture somehow wrong, as if they were human, but not quite. Complete. You shouldn't be in here, Mark. I spun around to find Stefan standing in the doorway, but instead of anger, his face held something much worse, a deep bone-weary sadness that seemed to age him decades in the dim light. I'm sorry, Uncle, I was just curious, he finished, stepping into the room and quietly closing the door behind him. That's good. Curiosity is what keeps us human. He moved to the desk and began gathering the papers with practiced efficiency. But some curiosities can get you killed. He said it so matter-of-factly that it took a moment for the words to register. What do you mean? Stefan paused, a medical photograph halfway to a manila folder. In it I could see burn marks on human skin arranged in a perfect grid pattern, like someone had pressed a hot waffle iron against flesh. You've heard the stories, haven't you? About your old uncle and his encounter with a flying saucer. I nodded. Most of it's true. The craft, the burns, the radiation, all documented, all verified by doctors and scientists and government officials who should know better. He finished gathering the papers and locked them in a metal filing cabinet. But the part they never tell, the part they made sure never got out, that's what could get us both in trouble. What part? Stefan sat heavily in his chair, suddenly looking every one of his 61 years. The part where I wasn't the only witness. The part where what I saw wasn't from another world. He met my eyes, and I saw something there I'd never seen before. Genuine fear. The part where they've been watching our family ever since, making sure we never tell the whole truth. Before I could ask what he meant, we heard my mother calling from downstairs. Stefan, Mark, come down for the toast. We should go, he said, standing. But as we reached the door, he put a hand on my shoulder. Mark, if something ever happens to me, if I have an accident or get sick suddenly or just disappear, there's a lockbox in my bedroom closet, behind the winter coats. The combination is your birthday, November 3rd, 1962. Inside you'll find everything they don't want you to know. Uncle Stefan, you're scaring me. He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. Good. Fear keeps you alive. Remember what I said about curiosity. It's what keeps us human. But fear is what keeps us breathing. That was the last meaningful conversation I ever had with my uncle. 3 months later, he was dead, officially from a heart attack, though he'd never had heart problems before. The funeral was small, attended by family and a few friends, but I noticed the two men in dark suits standing at the back of the cemetery. Men who didn't approach the grave or speak to anyone. Men who watched everything with the cold professionalism of people who did this for a living. I was 18 when I finally opened that lockbox. May 20th, 1967. My uncle walked into the woods, a man of science. He came back scorched by something no science could explain. According to the official record, the one you can find in UFO books and declassified government files, Stefan Michalak was an amateur geologist and prospector who had gone to the Falcon Lake area, about 80 miles east of Winnipeg, looking for quartz and silver. He was alone, which wasn't unusual for him. Stefan preferred the solitude of the wilderness to the company of most people. What happened next became one of Canada's most documented UFO encounters. At approximately 12:15 p.m, Stefan noticed two glowing objects descending from the sky. One landed briefly on a large flat rock about 160 feet away, then took off again. The second craft, metallic, disc-shaped, about 35 feet in diameter, settled onto the rock and remained there. For the next 30 minutes, Stefan observed the craft through welding goggles he'd brought for his prospecting work. He could hear mechanical sounds coming from inside, voices speaking what sounded like a Slavic language, and he could see a brilliant purple light emanating from within. Two door-like openings were visible on the side facing him. Being a methodical man, Stefan sketched everything he saw. The craft's dimensions, the pattern of lights around its circumference, the appearance of the two openings. He noted the time, the weather conditions, even the smell in the air, which he described as sulphur mixed with hot metal. This is where the official story gets interesting, and where Stefan's personal account, the one he shared with investigators but never with the press, becomes genuinely terrifying. Stefan claimed he called out first in English, then in several European languages, thinking he might be observing some kind of experimental aircraft. When he received no response, his scientific curiosity overcame his caution. He approached the craft. "I thought it might be Americans," he told the RCMP investigators, according to the transcripts I found in his lockbox. "Some kind of military test. I wanted to help if someone was in trouble." As he got closer, Stefan could see the interior of the craft through the open panels. Banks of lights in colours he'd never seen before, surfaces that seemed to bend light around them, and something else. Movement. Figures in what appeared to be protective suits moving purposefully around what looked like control panels. Stefan got within 30 feet of the craft when one of the panels suddenly slammed shut. He raised his hand and called out again, trying to indicate he was friendly. That's when he saw them clearly for the first time. Two figures appeared at the remaining opening. They were humanoid, but wrong somehow. Too tall, too thin, moving in a way that suggested they weren't entirely comfortable with terrestrial gravity. They wore what Stefan described as lead-lined suits that completely obscured their features, but he could see their eyes through faceplates that seemed to glow with their own internal light. The figures observed Stefan for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. Then one of them raised what might have been a hand, and Stefan felt a wave of something. Not heat, not sound, but a pressure that seemed to push against his thoughts themselves. "It was like they were reading me," Stefan told investigators, looking through me to see if I was a threat. Apparently they decided he was. The remaining panel began to close, but as it did, Stefan made a crucial mistake. He reached out and touched the craft's hull. The surface was smooth, almost frictionless, and warm. For just a moment, Stefan felt connected to something vast and ancient, a consciousness that spanned star systems and dealt in time frames that made human history seem like a single heartbeat. Then the craft expelled him. A grid of superheated air struck Stefan's chest and abdomen, burning through his shirt and undershirt to sear a waffle iron pattern into his flesh. The force threw him backward 15 feet, where he landed hard against a fallen tree. By the time he recovered enough to look up, the craft was rising silently into the sky, disappearing into the afternoon sun. Stefan managed to make it back to his car and drive himself to the nearest hospital in Kenora, Ontario. The medical staff was baffled by his burns. They showed clear signs of radiation exposure, but there was no identifiable source. The pattern was too regular to be accidental, too precise to be natural. Within 48 hours, investigators from the RCMP, the Department of National Defense, and the United States Air Force had converged on Falcon Lake. They found radioactive material at the site, metal fragments that didn't match any known alloy, soil samples that showed elevated radiation levels in a perfect circle 20 feet in diameter, and vegetation that had been killed in patterns that suggested exposure to focused microwave energy. Stefan was interviewed, re-interviewed, polygraphed, hypnotized, and subjected to every test they could devise. His story never changed. The evidence supported his claims. The radiation was real, the burns were real, the physical traces at the site were real. But the figures he described, the ones in the protective suits, those details were quietly removed from the official reports. National security, the investigators told him. Some details are better left classified. Stefan agreed to keep quiet about what he'd really seen inside the craft. It seemed like a reasonable request at the time. He had no way of knowing that his compliance had just painted a target on his back that would follow him for the rest of his life, or that the figures in the suits weren't from another world at all. He wasn't the only one to see it. He was just the one who lived. The cassette tapes in Stefan's lockbox contained recordings he'd made in the weeks following the incident. His voice, thin and exhausted, describing details he'd never shared with the official investigators. May 15th, 5 days before my encounter, spoke with Thomas Beargrease, one of the Ojibwe hunters who work the area around Falcon Lake. He's been seeing lights for weeks. Not just lights. Structured craft, moving in formation, always at night. Says the animals are scared. Deer won't come into the area anymore. Fish are gone from the lake. Even the insects have stopped singing. I listened to these tapes alone in my apartment at 2 a.m, the same age Stefan had been when he walked into those woods. The quality was poor, filled with static that might have been electromagnetic interference, but his words were clear enough. Thomas says his grandfather told stories about the Star People who came down to test the courage of warriors. But these aren't the Star People from the old stories. These are something else, something that doesn't belong here but has been here for a long time. According to Stefan's private notes, the military response to his encounter had been too fast, too organised. Teams of specialists arrived at Falcon Lake within 72 hours, equipped with radiation detection equipment, soil analysis kits, and metal detectors. They sectioned off the area and began what they called atmospheric radiation testing. A convenient cover story that kept civilians away while they collected evidence, but some of that evidence had been planted. June 8th, 1967, returned to the site against orders. Found metal fragments that weren't there before, arranged in a pattern that looks almost decorative. Someone wants this to look like an alien crash site. But why stage evidence for something that really happened? The answer was in a manila envelope hidden between the pages of a geology textbook, photocopied documents that Stefan had somehow obtained from an inside source. The letterhead read, Project Gabriel, Atmospheric Radiation Effects on Human Subjects, with classification markings that made my hands shake as I held them. Project Gabriel was real. Declassified documents confirm it was a Cold War-era study on nuclear fallout and its effects on human biology. But according to Stefan's stolen files, Gabriel had expanded far beyond simple radiation research. By 1967, they were testing advanced energy weapons, psychological warfare techniques, and something called controlled contact scenarios. The files contained test subjects' names, dates, locations, and results. Most of the names were blacked out, but I could read enough to understand what I was looking at. Field tests of exotic weapons on unwilling human subjects, often disguised as UFO encounters to discredit witnesses and maintain plausible deniability. Stefan's name was on the list. Subject demonstrates ideal psychological profile for contact scenario 7, read his evaluation. Isolated, scientifically minded, credible witness potential. Recommend full exposure with modified craft. radiation levels to be kept sublethal but sufficient for long-term monitoring opportunity. They hadn't been studying aliens. They'd been studying how far they could push a man, psychologically, physically, spiritually, before he stopped being one. The craft Stefan encountered wasn't from another world. It was a prototype vehicle developed from recovered technology, piloted by military personnel in environmental suits designed to obscure their human appearance. The radiation exposure wasn't accidental. It was a tracking device, a way to monitor Stefan's location and health for the rest of his life. But the most chilling discovery was a handwritten note in Stefan's careful script, dated just 3 weeks before his death. "They're not done with me. The burns faded years ago, but something else is growing. I can feel it in my bones, in my blood. The radiation wasn't just for tracking, it was a timer, and my time is almost up." Below that, in different ink as if added later, "They're watching the whole family now, especially Mark. His curiosity makes him dangerous. I should have kept him away from the truth, but it's too late now. If something happens to me, he's the only one who can finish this." I set the tapes aside and reached for the final item in Stefan's lockbox, a Polaroid photograph that made my blood turn to ice water. It was a surveillance photo, taken with a telephoto lens, showing me as a teenager standing in Stefan's study on that Christmas Eve night in 1978. I was holding one of his classified documents, clearly visible in the shot. At the bottom, someone had written in block letters, "Subject acquired. Maintain surveillance. Await further orders." They'd been watching me for over a decade, and they knew I had the files. The conspiracy went deeper than even Stefan suspected. Hidden among his geological surveys and mineral maps, I found a manila folder labelled Research Notes, Do Not Open Until After My Death. Inside were photocopied pages from what appeared to be a military manual stamped with classification so high I'd never seen their like. Gabriel Protocol, Field Manual for Exotic Weapons Testing. Chapter 12, Controlled Contact Scenarios. Section 4, Post-Contact Subject Management. The manual read like science fiction, but the dates, locations and personnel involved were all too real. Project Gabriel hadn't been just about nuclear fallout. It had evolved into something far more sinister. According to the documents, by the mid-1960s, the US military had recovered several craft of unknown origin from crash sites around the world. Rather than studying them in secret, a decision was made to reverse engineer the technology and test it on American and Canadian civilians as part of psychological warfare research. The goal wasn't to create flying saucers, it was to create the perfect cover story for weapons testing that would otherwise be considered war crimes. UFO encounters provide ideal cover for exotic weapons trials, read one memo dated March 15th, 1967, just 2 months before Stefan's encounter. Witnesses become unreliable due to social stigma. Media dismisses claims as fantasy. Government maintains plausible deniability while gathering crucial performance data. The Falcon Lake incident had been a field test of something called a focused microwave array, a weapon designed to deliver precise doses of radiation to human targets. Stefan's burns weren't accidental damage from an alien propulsion system. They were the intended result of a successful weapons test. But Stefan's case file contained details that chilled me to the bone. Subject responded exactly as predicted to Scenario 7, benevolent contact with hostile termination. Radiation exposure achieved optimal levels for long-term biological monitoring. Subject's credibility and scientific background make him ideal witness for cover story propagation. Recommend continued surveillance with periodic incidents to maintain psychological pressure. They'd been torturing him for years. Every strange phone call, every period of electronic interference, every mysterious illness. It had all been carefully orchestrated to keep Stefan isolated and afraid. And they documented it all with the cold precision of researchers studying lab rats. The final page in the folder was a personnel roster for Gabriel Team 7, Falcon Lake Operation. Most of the names were blacked out, but 2 were still visible. Dr. Marcus Webb, Ph.D., Psychological Operations Specialist Colonel James Hartwell, Exotic Weapons Testing Division. Below that, in Stefan's handwriting, Webb visited me at the hospital, said he was from the university, researching trauma responses, asked too many questions about what I saw inside the craft, took notes on everything I said. I thought he was trying to help me understand what happened. Now I know he was evaluating the success of their experiment. Stefan had been manipulated from the very beginning. His testimony, his medical records, even his decision to keep certain details classified. It had all been guided by his handlers, ensuring that the official story served their purposes while hiding the true nature of their crimes. But the most disturbing discovery was yet to come. Tucked between the pages of the manual was a single sheet of paper, a medical report dated just 6 months before Stefan's death. The letterhead read, Gabriel Biological Monitoring Station, Subject 67FL-001, Michalak Stefan. The report detailed the progression of what they called controlled cellular degradation, the long-term effects of the radiation exposure from his encounter. They'd been tracking the cancer growing in his body with the same methodical precision they used to plan their weapons tests. They knew he was dying. They'd designed it that way. And at the bottom of the report, a notation that made my hands shake. Subject's nephew, Mark Krochik, DOB 11-3062, shows identical psychological profile to primary subject. Recommend recruitment for Phase 2 testing upon subject termination. Phase 2 testing. They weren't done with our family. Stefan's death wasn't the end of their experiment. It was graduation to the next level, and I was the next test subject. That's when I noticed the cars. Black sedans parked at the end of my street. Different ones each day, but always there. Men in unremarkable suits who seemed to be reading newspapers but never turned the pages. Phone calls where no one spoke, but I could hear breathing on the other end. They weren't even trying to hide anymore. The surveillance was part of the psychological conditioning, designed to make me paranoid, isolated, easier to manipulate when they were ready to make their move. But Stefan had prepared for this possibility. Hidden in the back of his final journal, I found an address written in code, a cabin in the Manitoba wilderness, stocked with supplies and equipped with radio equipment that operated on frequencies the government didn't monitor. And a final message. If you're reading this, then they've started Phase 2. The cabin is your sanctuary, but only temporarily. They'll find it eventually, they always do. Use the time to prepare. The truth must survive, even if we don't. Over 40 people vanished from the area between 1966 and 1969. But you won't find that in the papers. Stefan's research had uncovered a pattern that the authorities either missed or chose to ignore. In the 3 years surrounding the Falcon Lake incident, dozens of people had disappeared from the wilderness areas of southeastern Manitoba and northwestern Ontario. Hunters, hikers, prospectors, fishermen, people who knew the woods and wouldn't get lost under normal circumstances. The disappearances followed a geographic pattern, forming a rough circle with Falcon Lake at its centre. Each vanishing occurred during periods of unusual atmospheric activity. Strange lights, electromagnetic disturbances, reports of low-frequency humming that could be felt more than heard. I found a detailed map in Stefan's files, marked with red X's for each disappearance and black dots for what he called secondary encounters, people who returned from the area with missing time, unexplained injuries, or psychological trauma they couldn't fully describe. The secondary encounters told a story that made my blood run cold. James McLeod, age 34, hunting guide. Returned from a 3-day trip with no memory of the final 18 hours. Found by search parties sitting by a cold campfire staring at the sky. Medical examination revealed elevated radiation levels and burn marks on his palms consistent with electrical contact. Sarah Chen, age 28, botanical researcher. Discovered unconscious near Falcon Lake with precise surgical incisions behind both ears. No memory of how she got there, or who might have performed the procedures. Scars healed with unusual speed, leaving behind tissue that pathologists described as inconsistent with normal human cellular structure. Thomas Beargrease, the Ojibwe hunter Stefan had spoken with, was found dead in his cabin 3 months after the Falcon Lake incident. Official cause of death was heart failure. but the coroner's notes mentioned anomalous brain activity and evidence of exposure to unknown electromagnetic fields. Each case file contained similar details: missing time, medical anomalies, and psychological trauma that left the survivors unable to function normally in society. Many ended up in psychiatric institutions. Others simply disappeared again, walking back into the wilderness and never returning. But the most disturbing discovery was a carbon copy of a letter Stefan had sent to the Royal Canadian Mounted Police in 1970, 3 years after his encounter. I have reason to believe the disappearances in the Falcon Lake area are connected to classified military operations. During my own encounter, I observed personnel in protective suits who appeared to be conducting experiments on local wildlife. I have since learned that several of the missing persons were last seen in areas where I later found evidence of weapons testing. Scorched earth, metal fragments, and radiation signatures consistent with advanced energy weapons. The response came from Inspector David Morrison of the RCMP Criminal Investigation Division. Mr. Michalak, while we appreciate your continued cooperation in the investigation of your 1967 incident, we must advise you that speculation about military connections to unrelated missing persons cases is not helpful to our efforts. We recommend you focus on your recovery and leave criminal investigations to qualified professionals. Below the official response, Stefan had written in pen, Morrison was at the site 2 days after my encounter. He knew exactly what they were testing and who was behind it. This isn't incompetence, it's a cover-up. The files contained one more piece of evidence that transformed my understanding of the entire conspiracy. A reel-to-reel tape recording made by a retired park ranger named Bill Henderson in the summer of 1968. Henderson had worked the Falcon Lake area for over 20 years. He'd seen Stefan's encounter from a distance, though he'd never come forward publicly. His voice on the tape was gravelly with age and fear. I was doing my evening rounds checking the campsites when I heard that sound again, like a generator running underwater but coming from the sky. I looked up and saw 3 of them, the same kind of craft Stefan described but smaller. They were hovering over the lake in formation, maybe 50 feet above the water. That's when I saw the boats. Military Zodiac rafts, 6 or 7 of them, all painted black. Men in full environmental suits were pulling something out of the water. Something big, something that moved like it was alive. They loaded it onto one of the craft and the whole formation took off toward the south. I watched through binoculars until they disappeared. Then I went down to the lake to see what they'd been doing. The water was warm, almost hot, and there were dead fish floating everywhere. But not just dead, cooked, like they'd been boiled from the inside. I reported it to my supervisor the next morning. He told me I'd been working too hard, that I should take some time off. When I came back 2 weeks later, my supervisor was gone. New man in charge, someone I'd never seen before. He told me there'd been a training exercise in the area, nothing to worry about, and if anyone asked, I was to refer them to the Department of National Defense. I kept my mouth shut for 30 years, but Stefan was right. This wasn't about aliens. This was about testing weapons on our own people, using the UFO story to cover it up. And anyone who got too close to the truth, well, you can see what happened to Stefan. Henderson's tape was dated August 15th, 1998. According to the obituary I found tucked behind the reel, he died 3 days later from what was described as sudden cardiac arrest. The pattern was clear, and it was accelerating. They were cleaning house, eliminating anyone who might have knowledge of the true nature of the Falcon Lake incident. And based on the surveillance I'd noticed around my apartment, I was next on their list. That's when I made the decision to disappear. The scars faded, but something else took hold. Stefan's cabin was exactly where his coded directions said it would be, hidden in a grove of white birch trees 40 miles north of Falcon Lake, accessible only by an overgrown logging road that hadn't seen vehicle traffic in years. The building itself was small but well constructed, with solar panels for power and a hand pump well for water. Inside, I found everything Stefan had promised: preserved food, medical supplies, and a sophisticated radio setup that could monitor military and emergency frequencies across North America. But more importantly, I found his final research. documents and recordings he'd hidden even from the lockbox in his bedroom. The truth was worse than I'd imagined. Stefan's journal entries from the months before his death revealed that his encounter at Falcon Lake had been just the beginning. The radiation exposure had done more than mark him for surveillance. It had changed him on a fundamental level, altering his brain chemistry in ways that made him sensitive to electromagnetic fields and able to perceive things beyond normal human sensory range. February 12th, 1981. The dreams are getting stronger. I can see them working, moving through their underground facilities like ants in a colony. They're not all human anymore. Some of them volunteered for the same kind of changes they forced on me, but in a controlled way. Enhanced, improved. They think they're becoming something better than human, but they're really becoming something less. The dream Stefan described matched exactly what I'd been experiencing since opening his lockbox. Visions of metallic corridors filled with figures in environmental suits, laboratories where human subjects were exposed to radiations that rewrote their genetic code, and vast underground complexes that stretched beneath the Canadian wilderness like veins in a diseased body. But it wasn't until I found the photographs that I understood why Stefan had been so afraid. Hidden in a lead-lined box beneath the cabin's floorboards were dozens of surveillance photos showing Stefan throughout his life. Not taken by government agents, but somehow captured from impossible angles, as if the cameras had been floating in mid-air. The images showed him at work, at home, even sleeping in his own bed. The final photograph in the series showed Stefan on the day before his death, standing in his backyard and looking directly at the camera with an expression of resigned acceptance. But he wasn't looking at a surveillance team or a hidden photographer. He was looking up at the sky, at something the camera couldn't capture but that had clearly terrified him. On the back of the photo, someone had written, "Subject termination authorized. Proceed with Phase 2 recruitment." That's when I realised they weren't watching me from cars parked on the street or through telephoto lenses. They were watching me the same way they'd watched Stefan, from above, using technology that shouldn't exist but clearly did. The radio equipment in the cabin began picking up transmissions 3 days after I arrived. Military frequencies carrying coded messages about asset recovery and northern operations. Most of it was routine, but one transmission made my hand shake as I transcribed it. Control, this is Eagle Eye 7. Target has relocated to grid reference Charlie 47. Recommend immediate extraction before subject accesses final documentation. Final documentation. There was something else Stefan had hidden. Something so important that they were willing to risk exposure to prevent me from finding it. I began searching the cabin systematically, checking every hiding place I could imagine. Behind loose floorboards, inside the walls, even in the septic tank, nothing. But Stefan had been a geologist, trained to think in 3 dimensions, and finally I thought to look up. In the attic, wrapped in plastic and tucked into the space between roof joists, I found a metal cylinder about the size of a coffee can. Inside were documents that made everything else seem trivial by comparison. They weren't from Project Gabriel. They were older, much older, with letterheads from something called Operation Majestic, a program that apparently predated Gabriel by 20 years. The papers detailed the recovery of crashed non-human vehicles beginning in 1947, not from Roswell, but from sites across Canada that had been kept classified at the highest levels of government. The technology recovered from these crashes had been reverse-engineered and weaponized, then tested on unwitting civilians to evaluate both its effectiveness and its psychological impact. But the most shocking revelation was the source of the original crashes. According to the Majestic files, the vehicles hadn't been extraterrestrial at all. They were time-displaced human technology, artifacts from our own future, somehow thrown back through temporal distortions created by atomic weapons testing. The beings recovered from the crashes were human, but changed by centuries of genetic manipulation and technological integration. We weren't being visited by aliens, we were being visited by ourselves. The Falcon Lake incident had been a test of time displacement technology, an attempt to create a stable temporal corridor that would allow information and personnel to move freely between past and future. Stefan's exposure to the exotic radiation had made him a living anchor point, a way for the future humans to monitor and influence events in the past. And now they wanted me to serve the same function. The final document in the cylinder was a personal message from Stefan, dated just hours before his death. Mark, if you're reading this, then the temporal displacement is accelerating. They've succeeded in creating a stable corridor, and they're using it to reshape history according to their needs. The cancer they gave me wasn't just to track my location, it was to test biological compatibility with their technology. They need genetic material from people who've been exposed to their temporal radiation, and they need it while we're still alive. I won't let them have it. By the time you read this, I'll have made sure my death was natural, not induced. But you're different. Younger, stronger, more resistant to their influence. You might be able to break the cycle. The cabin has been shielded with materials that disrupt their surveillance technology, but it won't hold them forever. Use the time you have to prepare, document everything, make copies, hide them where they'll be found by people who can act on the information. And whatever you do, don't let them take you alive. What they want to do to you, what they did to me, it's worse than death. It's erasure from history itself. That night, I began experiencing the dream Stefan had described. Visions of underground laboratories where human subjects were being transformed into something that barely qualified as alive. But unlike Stephen's dreams, mine came with a growing certainty that they weren't glimpses of the future. They were memories from the past, bleeding back through the temporal distortions that the time-displaced humans had created. I was remembering my own future, and it was a nightmare beyond description. If this reaches you, then either I'm wrong, or I've been found. It's been 6 months since I discovered Stefan's final documents, and the dreams have become constant now. Not sleeping dreams, but waking visions that overlay reality like a double-exposed photograph. I see the world as it is, but also as it will become. Empty cities overgrown with vegetation, skies filled with craft that move like living things, and humanity transformed into something that serves the temporal manipulators without question or resistance. The worst part is understanding that this future isn't inevitable, it's already happened, and we're living in the echoes of that transformed timeline. Every UFO sighting, every government cover-up, every person who disappears into the wilderness around Falcon Lake is part of a process that was completed centuries ago from the perspective of the time-displaced humans. We're not experiencing an invasion, we're experiencing an excavation, a systematic harvesting of genetic material and consciousness from key individuals throughout history, all to support a timeline where humanity's future is already written. The surveillance around the cabin has intensified. I can see them now without binoculars, figures in environmental suits moving through the trees at night, always staying just at the edge of vision. They're not trying to capture me yet. They're studying me, documenting the progression of the temporal sensitivity that Stefan experienced, waiting for the optimal moment to complete their harvest. But I've learned something they don't know I know. The radio equipment in the cabin has been modified with components Stefan salvaged from the Falcon Lake site, fragments of the original craft that somehow retain their temporal properties. When configured correctly, these fragments allow communication not just across space, but across time. I've been receiving messages from other versions of myself, other timelines where I made different choices. In one timeline, I surrendered to the time-displaced humans and became part of their collective consciousness. The version of me from that reality has been trying to warn me, sending fragmented messages through the quantum static. Don't trust the dreams. They're not visions of the future. They're programming. They're preparing your mind for integration. Resist the call to Falcon Lake. That's where the main temporal anchor is located. That's where they'll complete the process. But in another timeline, I fought back. That version of myself discovered how to disrupt their temporal manipulation technology using the same exotic radiation that marked Stefan for surveillance. The process requires returning to the original site and overloading the quantum field generators they've hidden beneath the lake. It's a suicide mission. The radiation exposure would be massive, far beyond what Stefan experienced, but it might be enough to collapse their temporal corridor and strand them in their own time, cutting off their ability to manipulate the past. I've been preparing for 3 days now, Stefan's cabin contained more than just documents. Hidden in a lead-lined vault beneath the radio equipment, I found a device he'd constructed from salvaged craft components. It looks like a backpack-mounted generator, but according to his notes, it's actually a temporal disruptor capable of creating localized time distortions. The device is untested. Stefan died before he could use it. But his calculations suggest it might be powerful enough to disrupt the quantum fields, maintaining the time-displaced humans' anchor point at Falcon Lake. If I'm successful, the temporal corridor will collapse. The future timeline where humanity becomes enslaved to these transformed beings might never come to pass. But the energy release will almost certainly kill me, and there's no guarantee that disrupting one anchor point will be enough to stop their entire operation. I'm leaving this recording because someone needs to know the truth. Someone needs to understand what really happened at Falcon Lake, and what's still happening to people who get too close to the truth. The Falcon Lake incident was never about aliens from another world. It was about humans from another time, our own descendants, transformed by centuries of genetic manipulation and technological integration, harvesting the past to ensure their own twisted evolution continues. Stefan Michalak wasn't the victim of an alien encounter. He was the victim of temporal warfare, marked for surveillance and eventual harvesting by creatures that had once been human, but had given up everything that made them truly alive. And I'm the next generation of their experiment, the son of a timeline they've been reshaping for decades, bred and conditioned to serve as an anchor point for their continued manipulation of history. But I refuse to play my assigned role. Tomorrow morning I'm returning to Falcon Lake. I'm going to activate Stefan's temporal disruptor and overload their quantum field generators. If the calculations are correct, the resulting explosion will create a paradox that severs their connection to our timeline permanently. If I'm wrong, well, then you'll never hear this recording, because they'll have succeeded in rewriting history to prevent it from ever being made. I'm hiding copies of Stefan's documents in locations around the lake, places where they'll eventually be found by researchers, journalists, or government investigators who might be able to act on the information. The truth needs to survive, even if we don't. The most important thing to remember is that the time-displaced humans are vulnerable to their own technology. The temporal radiation that allows them to manipulate the past also makes them dependent on quantum field generators to maintain their existence in our timeline. Disrupt those generators, and they'll be pulled back to their own time like a rubber band snapping. I can hear them moving through the trees now. They know I've discovered their weakness, and they're closing in. But they're too late. The disruptor is armed, the documents are hidden, and I'm already walking toward the lake. If you're listening to this, then some version of the plan worked. The truth survived, even if I didn't. Use it wisely. Use it to stop them before they can complete their harvest of human consciousness. And remember, the next time you see strange lights in the sky or hear stories about UFO encounters, ask yourself, are you witnessing visitors from another world? Or are you seeing the shadow of humanity's own twisted future, reaching back through time to ensure its own creation? The answer might determine whether our species has any future at all. This is Mark Krochik, nephew of Stefan Michalak, recording what may be my final message. The date is October 31st, 2024. The time is 3:47 a.m. I'm standing at the edge of Falcon Lake and I can see lights beneath the water. The glow of the quantum field generators that have been hidden here for over 50 years. The temporal disruptor is activated. The energy readings are off the charts. In about 60 seconds, either this timeline will be freed from their manipulation, or it will be erased entirely. Either way, the experiment ends here. The water is getting brighter. I can feel the radiation building. The same burning sensation Stefan described, but magnified 1,000 times. The figures in environmental suits are emerging from the forest, moving toward me with desperate urgency. They know what I'm about to do, but they're too late. 30 seconds now. The device is beyond the point of no return. The quantum fields are destabilizing, and I can feel reality itself beginning to bend around me. Time is moving in loops, showing me fragments of possible futures, some where humanity remains free, others where we become the very monsters I'm trying to stop. 15 seconds. The lake is boiling now, steam rising in patterns that shouldn't be possible. The time-displaced humans are screaming, a sound that exists outside normal hearing, transmitted directly into my consciousness. They're being pulled back to their own time, their anchor point in our reality dissolving. 10 seconds. The burning is unbearable now, but I can see through the pain to something beyond. A timeline where Stefan lived a normal life, where people don't disappear in the wilderness, where the sky belongs to birds instead of temporal predators. 5 seconds. If anyone finds this recording, remember that the truth is worth any sacrifice. Remember that some choices echo across centuries, and that sometimes the only way to save the future is to